All right, welcome to Fatherhood Secrets. I am your host. I'm Matt Timmons, and I got a really, really special guest for us that is going to give us some little bit of insight into parenting and coaching and how are men supposed to deal with that, the tough stuff. And when it comes to coaching, there's no better person. He's a former multi-sport athlete. He has his master's in athletic administration, and he's taught the art of positive coaching for parents, and he is the president of the Idaho Youth Sports Commission, giving back to the community here in Idaho. And help me welcome Mr. Tim Brady.
I hope in our time here between you and I, we can share some nuggets worthwhile for those that might choose to listen.
The goal for this episode is really to help men connect with their kids and through your experiences. And so I know you've got a lot to share, but let's rewind the clock a little bit. And what was your experience like growing up as a multi-sport athlete, and what were some of the challenges?
I ended up playing lots of sports growing up. I ran track and cross country in high school. I wrestled for my first years. And I broke the family tradition, which was the riskiest, most intense, scariest decision of my life at the time. But I did switch over, and it all worked out fine. And then I ran for 1 year at the collegiate level, and it really wasn't for me. Didn't like it so much. It was I just got to the point where it was so much and a little bit overwhelming for me. So that was kind of it for me. And then, but the experience for me, growing up in the family and all that, my dad owned a sporting goods store, a team sporting goods store too. So it was just out there in front of us, all the time. We'd go to games and my dad'd say, "Hey, I sold those uniforms and those balls and whatnot." So it was just there, front and center all the time. And it was a great molder, shaper, kind of that chisel of character, right? That really truly is still going on for me in the work I do. And I think of the sports as such a great classroom.
Yeah, of course. And so we talk about a lot in my family is using the vehicle of sports to build character and just build the young men that I've been called to raise. I have 4 boys, and I'm sure it was the same for you guys growing up, where everything's a competition and everything is sports. If they're not playing on the field in a game, they're home outside in the park and they're playing wiffle ball, and or they're wrestling, or they're playing made up games of trying to throw socks on fans. Everything is so competitive. But I think, at the end of the day, the competition's fun because it builds character. It shows them, and it builds and it pours into the bucket a little bit. I'm sure that was kind of the same for your family.
Yeah, for sure. I think about, being around the ballpark now and watching the younger ones out there run around like yours do.
Yeah.
Right. Run around the ballpark. And that kind of modeling is really hard to duplicate. You're not having to do anything, but they're going to the game and they're watching. And they're watching mom and dad, and there's some kind of enjoyment there, or you wouldn't be spending your time doing it. Right. So just that kind of modeling truly is invaluable.
And so let's talk about a little bit about raising athletes yourself. Now, I know just by knowing you, your son is actually my son's coach, and it's how we've got connected. But the reason that we chose your son to pour into my son is because of how he carries himself as a coach. But that doesn't just come by accident. So you had 2 young athletes in the house. What were some of those challenges, and how did you get him specifically to build such a great character and pour into others?
I think for me, in the whole journey of sports parenting, it was, one of the hardest things for me, as I would say, is as a dad, maybe, on the sidelines and, as a coach, was to keep it in perspective. And I know that sounds really cliche and simple, but it's not. It's incredibly hard. and it's not simple because we all have that desire, right, for our kids to succeed. And at first, early years, I kind of went to the school of hard knocks of sports parenting. I had this buried intensity, mostly quiet. I would stew in the stands, and there was times, honestly, I couldn't stand myself. I couldn't stand to be around myself. I'd get nervous and all that kind of thing. So I think there's always that internal battle, that I probably starting out got better as time went, and mostly because I think my antennas were open or up, and I was aware. I was always trying to be aware of, man, what's the right thing to do? And so I think that was my biggest challenge. I think I learned along the way kind of three things that I asked myself, and one of them is whose game is it? Who owns this? And the second one being, the long game versus the short game. The short term being the outcomes, the performances, the wins, versus the long game. What's important 2 hours from now? What's important a week from now? What's important a month from now, and even further beyond? And then last, which came really late for me, the reflective question of what does success look like? I really had to take a look at redefine success and what society says success is.
Yeah.
And so those kind of three things kind of slowly kind of grew and evolved for me. Through it. I didn't start out on fire and know everything. There's no way. I learned through experience.
Yeah. And so you mentioned success and what it looks like. I think just from my coaching background, and I've made a ton of mistakes, but there's transactional success and then there's transformational success where on one hand, as a coach, you want to win. There is something inside me that is very competitive, that I desire to win, but at what cost? Do you sit a player that's not performing, or do you keep players out of the game that don't do the job as well? In success, it's funny that you say that, because now as a nearly 40-year-old man, father of four, I've got different stages of kids and their ages where success looks different, and we're continuously pouring in and trying to transform them into these men that they're supposed to become. And maybe they're collegiate athletes and maybe they're not, but when you talk about transactions versus transformational success, I think they're two totally different buckets.
And the scoreboard's a heavy thing, right? I mean, it's so easy for that to be such a big part of the focus, the outcomes and the scoreboard. And it's not easy to remind ourselves that there's a bigger piece out there. And that's not to say that winning and losing isn't important, because there's great value in learning to win and lose, right? And so, but being intentional about reminding ourselves, okay, what is the bigger picture here?
Yeah.
And you talked about age. You kind of talked about age appropriate. What's age appropriate? And when does the scoreboard and performances and all that become, I guess the transaction become maybe a little bit more of a focus. But I hope all the way through at least high school that there's this development piece. I hope youth sports, is and always will be a development zone. For kids.
And I've done it myself where I pushed too hard. And when Landon was 7 or 8 years old, he was on a highly competitive baseball team in Texas that was very transactional. And one of the best coaches that I've ever been around. I love the guy to death. I still talk to him, even though we live in different states. And Landon loves him. But what it led to is me just pushing and pushing. And so what we would do is we'd go to practice 3 days a week, and then we'd go home and we'd do more practice. And inevitably one of us would be frustrated because, you drop a pop fly, then I get frustrated, and then I get frustrated, and Landon starts to mirror my behavior. He's frustrated now. And, at 8 years old, it took me a long time to realize this is not great. And so with that, have you experienced, pushing too hard, and, as from an athlete's perspective, and then how'd that kind of transition into, fatherhood and your relationship with your kids, and how that affect, your household?
That's really a great question to think about. And I think for me, maybe, a little bit like you, right? That I don't know if there's necessarily a moment for me, but more moments, that were kind of out there. And I was very cognizant, I distinctly remember thinking about, man, pushing too hard or pull back, what is it? And this was back in the day, pre-internet, right? It was asking friends and reading books. And so it was always this constant walk on the tightrope, right? And because I think it's a very non-linear thing. And that's because every parent, every child is unique. Even you have 4 kids, and my guess is they're all unique in a way that, well, as much as they probably are similar, my guess is they have some different characteristics. So it's something that has to be taken into consideration, is because everybody's different personalities, whatever it might be. And so for me, I remember picking up a book called Champions Are Raised, Not Born. And it was by Summer Sanders, who was an Olympic swimmer, world-class. She was an Olympic gold medal swimmer and a world-class swimmer. And I just remember the gist of the book was that her dad was very hands-off. He was kind of the life of the party, before the competition, after the competition, making jokes, making light of everything, trying to make sure everybody had fun, not just his daughter, but the parents around him, the coach, himself. And while as much as I wanted to be, Bob Sanders, it wasn't my personality, but the message resonated with me. It resonated. I go, wow, here's a hands-off guy who has, raised 2 pretty incredible swimmers. I think her brother was a pretty good swimmer, maybe not as accomplished. And then I think there's another piece here that I recall a definite piece or sticking point with me is there was 2 guys in town, Dr. George Wade, who just recently passed away. God rest his soul. I love that man. He was the Boise State team doctor and founder of the Idaho Sports Medicine Institute, and Jim Everett, who built all these YMCAs in town, and now just stepped down as president of the College of Idaho. But they had this sports parenting seminar, and they put this ad in the paper, this half-page ad that was about sports parenting. And I don't remember the exact name of the topic, but it was something to do with best practices. And, they had some people up there, and I remember they had Linda Pelikoff was up there, who was a sports psychologist from Boise State University, and a kind of a leading researcher at the time in youth sports. And I remember her saying, what I do remember for that seminar was that she said, don't coach your kid on the way home. This was back in 1995.
Yeah.
And I kind of went, whoa, my antennas went up, and I kind of slinked down in my seat. I couldn't hide. There wasn't that many people in the room. But I thought, you know what? Yeah, with my son, Tim, I was coaching football at the time. And I used to like to give the advice and the solutions and the lectures on the way home about the way I thought, things should be happening. Well, it didn't go very well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we ended up butting heads, but it was great advice. I don't know that, can't say I got an A+ from then on, but it certainly helped to avoid that piece of it. And so I think that pushing, pulling back is a constant adjustment. And I think being aware of it is just a great start. It's a constant battle, hard to execute, but if you listen and pay attention to kids, they give you cues.
Yep.
They give you cues. They might not tell you, but their body language and their nonverbals are pretty strong. So if we're tuned into those, I think we kind of know. I think we know if we're pushing too hard or pulling back. And I think most parents kind of get it, but sometimes it's a gray area.
Yeah. You mentioned, each one of my kids is different. You mentioned, being unique. And I remember one time, and Colton was really young, maybe 5, maybe 6. And we're hitting off a tee, and I'm trying to just chunk it all the way down so where we can have the same approach, hit the same. And I'd notice he'd get these ticks where he'd have to go to the bathroom all of a sudden. And it took me about 3 or 4 weeks to realize that I was pushing too hard and I was causing it, and I was causing him to break down, and his escape was, I got to go to the bathroom. And once it hit me, I was almost in tears because I felt the need to help him, but I wasn't smart enough to realize that one kid of mine was okay with this instruction and another kid was not okay with it. And I had to figure it out as a parent to go, you know what, my kids are totally different and I have to coach them differently. And which really is a good segue into my next question is, you know, you've worked with thousands of parents, of sports parents, and, you know, what's the biggest mistake you see parents and how they support their kids?
Yeah, you know, I would say this, I guess, that, you know, first of all, I'm not an expert for sure. I'm not a sports psychologist. You know, I have studied some good curriculums for sure. And maybe my best curriculum was a School of Hard Knocks that I mentioned, you know, and I don't know if there is a thing as a perfect parent. You know, if there is one, I haven't met them. You know, I certainly made my mistakes, and sports parenting, like a lot of parenting, isn't black and white. You know, it just isn't. So, you know, I guess from my point of view, when you ask about maybe the bigger mistakes that parents might make, is I would say probably there are two. One of them being that we as parents, that we jump in and try to rescue our kids from disappointment, probably too often. And I think it's really a hard thing though, because it's inherent in us as parents from the time our kids were born and very young. That's what we do, right? Yeah. We rescue them, we jump in and fix it. You know, we save them from dangers and the pitfalls that go on out there. Well, and so when you get into sports, it's, you know, when I think we have the best intentions of trying to rescue our kids, but we're actually counterproductive, you know, when we do that. Again, we love our kids, but we miss those chances. We miss those chances when they fail, to let them wrestle a struggle, you know, to hit the pause button, give them time to wrestle with it. You know, if we jump in and try to advise and give solutions and lecture, you know, we're denying them those golden opportunities to regulate their emotions, to build resilience, you know, to learn to deal with failure, to build those internal muscles. So I think that's a big one. It's a powerful force though. It's really powerful and it's hard. It's a hard challenge, but I think that's one.
Yeah, I was thinking when you said that four of my kids wrestle, and they're not primarily wrestlers. Like, they don't love the sport. It's something that my wife and I both believe in, and that this is going to build a foundation. And we've seen great things come from wrestling. But the moments after a match, you cannot coach them or try to pour into them and lecture them and try to give them lessons. You should have done this. It's just the hardest thing they've ever done. And right after the match, in a win or in a loss, where you have to just give some type of encouragement and just put your arms around them, because there's not much learning going on at that point. You know, a kid, you know, if you boot a ground ball and they're upset, they're already upset about it. And as a parent, it's hard not to go, yeah, you got to work from the ground up, buddy, get your grub down, when they're not ready to hear it. All they want to hear is, hey, you got the next one. Or, you know, I love you. If you feel the ground ball, you don't feel the ground ball. It doesn't change how I feel about you.
Yeah, I think that's great, Matt. I do. I think that's fantastic. And it reminds me of you know, the moments after a game or after the air are so emotional, right? Yeah. For them. And and you too.
Yeah.
But I think of Paul Rush, who was he's the athletic director over at NNU, and he coached men's basketball at the high school level, and then at NNU for about 5 years. And I thought he had a really great little story that he said with his team, and these are 18 to 22-year-olds. And after the game, the only thing he said is, "Hey, I love your effort, love you guys. I'll see you tomorrow at practice," and that's it. So these are 18 to 22-year-olds, because he realizes that for them to take in a whole lot of instructions at that time, at an emotional time, isn't good. 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it is. And then everybody's in this better place, right, to maybe give instruction and receive instruction. So I think that's fantastic. And I think the second mistake, I would say this, that parents make is talking negatively about the coach in front of their kids.
Yeah.
I think it's such a disservice that parents do. And I see it happen way too often. I think kids get caught in the middle of this noise that doesn't help them perform. It undermines their learning. It undermines their motivation. If you're a kid and, mom or dad is talking about the coach in a negative fashion, they don't know what they're doing, they make bad decisions, well, why should I get better?
Yeah.
If mom and dad think the coach is incompetent, geez, then why should I work hard to get better? So
Hard
it
to
really,
build trust.
yeah, it kind of fosters a little bit of this victim mentality, which isn't helpful for anybody. And by and large, it's just in front of your kids is bad behavior.
Yeah.
It's truly bad behavior. It's bad sportsmanship. So that's one thing I see that I wish was, maybe it's getting better. I don't know, but
Yeah. I don't know. I think my wife and I have always done a pretty good job of not doing that in front of our kids. And because we're both athletes growing up and we've both been around it. And we're around athletics all year long. I mean, we probably take 2 weeks off in the summer, 2 weeks off in the fall, but everything outside of that is sports driven. And, there's when my oldest son was playing for that coach, a coach that was very tough on the kids, and those kids performed so well. And oftentimes my wife and I would have conversations like, man, is this the best coach for our son? And he was performing, doing great. But at the end of the day, we always held it in our hearts that until our athlete comes to us to talk about the coach or the coaching style or the play time or anything like that, then we're just going to let it simmer. Because you take, a coach, maybe it's not their profession, maybe it is their profession, but severely either not paid or severely underpaid and pouring in their time. And then you get undermining, and then you get, relational flaws between the athlete and the coach. And then, the production goes down, the athlete stops loving the game. And so, that's a great point you bring up, is just not to berate the coach or speak negatively about them. And the other thing you said was, be mindful of the 24 or 48 hour rule, where, there's a lot of emotions. And sometimes when we speak with emotions, we're not saying exactly what we mean. We're just saying what we feel. And sometimes the feeling isn't great. And sometimes our brain is lying to us and we just don't know it. And so, yeah, it's a great point. And then the other thing I see is, there's a difference between healthy encouragement and, some harmful pressures that parents put on kids. And so from your experiences with parents or from your teams, did you ever have to have conversations with parents to let them know, like, hey, this is helpful or this is harmful? Or, what advice would you give a parent that is maybe struggling with that watching this?
Yeah, that's a few times I did, for sure. I recall talking to parents and without remembering the exact conversation, it was, hey, they need a break. They need a break here, lighten up. But I think most parents understand, the difference between healthy encouragement and harmful pressure. but understanding it and executing it are two different stories. Again, and I think that goes back to when we talked about observing, being a keen observer of your child's cues, and what's going on, their nonverbals, their self-esteem, their enthusiasm, their energy, their resilience. Are they engaged? What's their body language look like? And, the healthy encouragement is really, truly easy to see, if they are engaged, if they're enthusiastic, and body language is good. They're talking about it. They want to be with their friends. That's probably a good sign that the encouragement is healthy. Now, on the other side of it, when it gets maybe to be a distraction or less than healthy, maybe harmful pressure, I think, you see maybe an increased or maybe an excessive fear of failure. Because every kid, there's always a little bit of fear of failure in there, depending on game to game, right? But if that gets to be excessive, or it's just a constant, there's something going on,
Yeah.
right? If it's just, it's up and down a little bit, right? Things are with kids. And I don't think in this question, you look at a short period of time, right? Look at a bigger picture period of time when you're looking at, whether, that's healthy or harmful to them. But if there's a heavy focus on outcomes, right, that increases the excessive fear of failure. If there's this heavy pressure on outcomes and performances, well, chances are there's some negative pressure there going on, wherever it might be coming from. So I think those two things, and then there's the real excessive stuff like the withdrawing. Well, you talked about your son physically, he showed a physical symptom. I got to go to the bathroom. And you picked up on it, right? So I think it's having an awareness and being somewhat reflective, so big, that you picked up on it.
Yeah, and for me, it was so interesting because we have the two. They're really young, and one kid can go all day. We can be in the gym all day long working on whatever sport we're working on, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, whatever it was. And the other kid is, man, as soon as I challenged his thought process, or as soon as I challenge him in a way to, very simply, okay, when you approach the plate, this is what you got to do. This is your landing mark each time. And it was night and day. And recognizing it late led me to at least make sure I surrounded him with the right coaches, because I know how he responds. And it helped me keep the right things about making sure I surrounded him with people that were pouring into his bucket instead of taking water from it. And in those moments, I was taking water from his bucket. I wasn't filling it up. I was causing some distress in him. And, and you mentioned outcomes, and we're all chasing rings, and, it's fun to win a ring, or it's fun to win the big trophy. But, at the end of the day, at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, I still got to get up and go to work tomorrow, and you guys still got to go to school tomorrow. So this doesn't really, the outcome's not necessarily the end goal. I would say the end goal is, did you get 1% better? Did you overcome something that was tough? Did you encourage your teammates today when your teammate was down? Did you go put your arm around them, sort of thing? And so from your experiences, how did you focus that in your house, or maybe experiences through coaching other parents? How did you get them to see the right things and keep the right things, those right things?
Yeah, gosh, I think looking at that is two things that come to mind is, what are those right things and why? Why are the right things important, and helping parents to understand why those right things are important. And I think there's one step that we miss as parents, and maybe sometimes coaches too, is what are our child's goals for playing? Why do they play?
Mm-hmm.
What do they want to take from the experience? Mm-hmm. And, finding that out, and then having you as a parent take the same, write the same things down. Well, what do you want your child to take from this experience, and what's your goals for them? And then match them up, and see what they look like. And it's not that they necessarily, what your child wants out of the experience and what you want out of the experience needs to align, but awareness is the key, right? That you're aware of what they want, and then you're kind of aware of what you want. And, if there's some goals out there that are way too outcome oriented or way far out there, and maybe not enough focused around building character in the process and all those other, psychological benefits and social benefits that sports give us, then, you can have the conversation. But I think it's pretty important to, know that why they play to start with, so that then you can get into the what's of the right things. Right.
And that's huge. I'd never thought about aligning goals. And I've been around coaching for forever. I mean, I've been coaching football for almost 20 years, and I've never done that practice where, hey, I'm going to have you guys write down what you want out of this season, and I'm going to write down what I want out of this season. And as a parent, I've never done that with my kids. And it's one of those simple things. Most wisdom nuggets are very simple, and you hear about them, you go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But man, what a nugget that is, because I think there's a lot of misalignment there where, you'll hear parents all the time screaming at their kid, trying to get them in the right position and over yelling over the coach. And their goals may be different. The goals may be just different than their child's goals, which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it gives a good perspective, and it gives you a place to have that information in front of you to make good decisions and strategies and plans of how you want to approach. It's easy for us, especially us dads, right, to assume why our kids play. Well, probably we assume they're playing because of the same reasons we played. Well, maybe. Maybe our number one's their number four.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, exactly. If we have our foot on the gas, full throttle, of the scoreboard and wins and the performances, usually we're ultimately hurting performance and hindering development, when we're 100% on outcomes. Right. And, it's easy to be down that road for sure.
Yeah.
And so, but when you understand that what, the why behind the what, if I'm focused 100% on the scoreboard and not on, how we get those wins, the process, right? Yeah. The mastery of how we get those wins, then, we are hurting our own performance. So I hope right there, that's enough of a short-term motivation for parents to know that, hey, if I'm focused on truly the right things, and the science tells us that, the best practitioners in the field tell us that a process focus centered around a growth mindset is where, development takes place. And it kind of aligns with why kids play. Kids play because they want to be good at something.
Yeah.
Well, if they want to be good at something and you're centered around teaching around a growth mindset, of how you want to hit 400. Okay, you want to hit 400. Well, how do you get there?
Yeah.
And what are those best practices, principles, and fundamentals? And is that your focus?
Yeah.
So, and this, right? This stuff was very well.
It's really good. And I don't think as a parent, we have enough conversations about growth mindset, especially with my kids who are all athletic, but allowing them to just understand, hey, some of these conversations we're going to have are about our growth mindset, to figure out, what's our next step, our closest next step. We don't want to jump 5 steps away, but growth overall is just one little piece at a time. And then at the end of say a year, or at the end of the timeline, you look back and you go, man, I've come so far. I think that's a huge nugget for parents to lean on, because no matter what they do, no matter if it's, want to be a professional video game player, I think the growth mindset is, when you first start, you're not going to be great. and then you're gonna, be maybe a little worse than you were. Then you're gonna be kind of good, and then you're gonna be good, and then you're gonna be kind of okay, and then you're gonna be kind of great, and then you're gonna be great. And so I think it's a huge talking point. It almost seems like dinner table talk to me, where we kind of, forecast this growth mindset and speak on it, and it's really cool. And
Yeah, I think that you hit bite-sized chunks is kind of what you said there, and that's a big piece of it. But what are it really comes down to the growth mindset is what's in your control, right? Well, is getting a hit and getting a hit every at bat in your control? Well, no, but what is in your control is your approach to the plate, all those things that you work on, right? Those are those things in your control. That's where kids, when they feel like they have a little piece of control of this situation, right? That now you got something going when they feel a little bit in control.
Yeah,
because you don't have control of the pitcher.
No.
Of a bigger, stronger, faster pitcher up at the plate, right? But
not at all.
You do have control of all the things that you can do, and if you can get that done, you'll get your wins and you get your hits.
Yeah, you get your hits. And so, it brings me to a point where we talk about parenting and the growth process. From your experience, have you seen a kid succeed not by talent, but by something either you've heard their parents say, or maybe you coached their parent to say, and then it equated into what their success looked like?
I guess what I see is when I see kids out there playing with like this untethered passion and this minimal fear of failure, I always kind of wonder what those parents are doing, and I think some of that can be, their personality, right? A kid's personality, but I also think that can be nourished, as a parent. Maybe 3 years ago, actually a parent on your team, and I don't know if you want to list this live and you can edit it out, but his parents, I think when he was 8 years old, I was following his dad out of Settlers Park there, and he didn't know I was behind him. I don't think he knew me from Adam, and he was, walking out, and he said, he was saying to Sam, he goes, "Well, Sam, what'd you think of the game?" And he goes, "Did you learn anything?" I couldn't hear what Sam was saying because he was talking so mildly, but I go, "Wow." I go, "Man, Sam's dad, that was pretty cool." Watching him, and I think his son really seems to kind of play pretty, it feels to me like untethered, doesn't worry about a heck of a lot. He just kind of cuts it loose and goes.
Yeah.
And I think much like your son does. I think your son does that too. And so when I watch that, I go, wow, that's pretty cool. And it's not always common to see that. But there was a girl I also coached in high school who I knew her parents a little bit, and I could just by the way they talked, man, if she had a bad game, if she had a bad game, guaranteed the next game coming back, man, she was hustling and playing kind of this reckless abandon on defense, trying to make plays. It was almost like a guarantee. And I go, man, there's no blame game going on, man. She's taking them on herself. She owns this. She's coming in the next game and she's doing everything within her control to make things happen. So I think that's what it kind of looks like when parents focus on giving their kids kind of ownership.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so, we all deal with losses, and you witnessed this last weekend. Our baseball team had a tough lost a game we probably shouldn't have lost. But, in those moments, tough loss, and you've been through positive parenting, you've had experiences with, positive parenting, what would you say to, a dad out there that just needs a little advice on how do I get my kid through this tough loss positively and continue this growth mindset rather than, having a negative impact on a loss?
Yeah, I love the question. And I kind of mentioned this before, the word positive is kind of interesting. It gets this connotation of soft and balloons and cake and everything's fun and everything's joyful and happy all the time. But that's not the way that, I define positive parenting, or the word positive for that matter, in sports. I think it's truly about creating that space and that environment where kids can grow and flourish, and there's a space for development and learning, and learning how to bounce back and be resilient, and make a mistake, bounce back, make a mistake, bounce back, creating that place. And especially in the tough moments, the challenging moments, because that's where the real parenting, right, and the real coaching takes place, is during those tough times. And sports are a great teacher.
Yeah.
They're a great teacher if we allow it.
Yeah. And
if we allow it to happen.
and we had that tough loss, game we shouldn't have lost. We have practice yesterday, and one of the things that we were mentioning to the team was, yeah, we lost. It is what it is, right? Outcome's the outcome. Today we're here. Today is still here. We're practicing just like we would have been. But not holding that weight of the loss, because some kids were still on it. And you, as a coach, we get to a point where, how many times have we practiced blocking balls, off speed count, curveball in the dirt? How many times, honestly? And through a whole season of baseball, maybe 5 times. So how do you expect to be successful in that circumstance? You can't. That's on us coaches. It's us. We've got to create the practice plan for you to succeed. That way, when the moment comes up, you've already been prepared, and you can see the weight just go down. It's not about your performance, or if you had the ability to perform. You're all great athletes, and that doesn't change. But sometimes it's on the coaches and not on you, and you don't have to carry the weight. And those conversations, Tim is the first coach that I've been around where at the beginning of the practice, we spend about 15, 20 minutes talking about the game. And in those tough moments, the easy ones are easy. You win. Oh man, it's great. We hit a bomb. We have 15 strikeouts.
Yeah.
The tough ones are letting the kids just be weightless from whatever happened in that game.
I like that term that you use, weightless. You guys have, and I'm happy to hear that, that Tim, shifting that pressure off of them onto you as coaches, taking, the responsibility as coaches. Because, gosh, Matt, you see it. You see it on TV. You see it, on talk radio. You see it where, even at the higher levels, you see coaches say, well, the kids didn't do this and they didn't do that, and we didn't hit, we didn't field. Well, there's a piece of taking that responsibility of coaches that I think is like what you guys did in that situation is rare, and I think it's just higher level coaching. So kudos to you guys.
Yeah, Tim is, I would tell you this, Landon is on Tim's team for that reason. And so the culture is great. Everything that's said is great, which kind of leads into my next question is, culture in sports in Idaho. It's not coming from Texas. It's a lot different. It's a lot different in Texas than it is here. I'm not sure it's, or it should be the same or it should be different. If I had to choose between the two, knowing what I know, I would choose the culture in Idaho versus the culture in Texas, because the focus is breeding athletes, and it's very transactional, which is not the worst thing. It's, it works for people, and it worked for me while I was there, and I loved it, and I would go back. But what do you think about the culture overall in sports? And if you could change one thing about the culture in Idaho, what would that be?
I think it's kind of a toss-up when you ask that question. I would say a focus on, for parents, for directing this at parents, a focus on your child's enjoyment of the game, their effort, their learning, that growth mindset, not solely on the performance and the outcome. That's a big one. That's a tough one. because we all love to win, and it's hard not to, lighten that load, kind of like what you talk about. And then I think the other one is give children the ownership of the experience. I think those two things would create this more, child-centered environment where, they can grow and, flourish. And, you look at the timeline, if you take a whiteboard and map out a timeline of your child's life, from 0 to 80, as I getting up there in age, maybe, 85, 90, whatever that is. And then just put a mark there of the years in their sports experience, of how long they're playing. And, you're going to find out how insignificant, how short a period this time is in their life. And so when I say focusing on their enjoyment, and your enjoyment, it goes so fast.
Yeah.
It goes so stinking fast. So, and not necessarily just ask me, ask any former sports parent or grandfather. Say, what's one thing you do, you wish, when you were watching that you would do? Ask them, ask them what they would do. And I think you're going to hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Hey, enjoy the experience, man. Chances are they're going to enjoy it too. You're modeling it, they're going to enjoy it too. And what does that breed? If they're finding more joy, like you're finding more joy, well, then does that become self-fulfilling, right?
Yep. And it's crazy. It's crazy that you say that, because one of my buddies, Justin Forsett, played running back for the Baltimore Ravens, went to Cal. I think he was on the Seahawks too. And I think his Pro Bowl year was from the Ravens, and he has a large family like mine. I think he's on his 5th or 6th kid now. And his kids are old enough where he's coaching, and we actually coach together, and just a great guy, great human. And I asked him a very similar question. What would you do different? What are you doing different? And he had told me, I'm just slowing down, making sure my kids love the experience that they're getting and not taking away from that experience. Because all in all, even if you become a Pro Bowl running back and you have a substantial NFL career, it's very short. It's very short-lived. And most people don't make it to the pros, and so it's even shorter. Most people may not play baseball in high school, so it's even shorter. So, to your point, instead of knocking them down, focusing on the negative, and always, you got to do this better, slow down and enjoy it, because you're right, it's not going to last forever. And Justin made that point, and it's funny that you're making the same point. It's almost like you guys spoke to each other before you got on the call. And so it's a really good topic. And so, the next thing I want to jump into really quick before we kind of end, I know we're getting short on time, I want to be respectful of your time, is the Idaho Sports Youth Commission. I stumbled on this when I met Tim, and there was a brief conversation that we had, and I didn't even know it existed. I didn't even know it was out there. And I just fell in love with the idea and the concept and of the Idaho Youth Sports Commission, because I think there's, parents and kids are underserved, and we can help serve them. And so talk to me about, the mission of the Idaho Youth Sports Commission, and kind of what you guys do, kind of your outreaches for coaches and parenting and kids, and just fill us in on the mission.
Yeah, so we got started, I've been at this for probably 15 years, part-time, and inspired by two mentors of mine, Dr. George Wade, who I mentioned just recently passed, and Jim Everett. And they're the ones that consequently put on that seminar, and they, tried to get something like this going years ago. It kind of died on the vine, and then they approached me and said, "Hey, do you want to get this going?" I said, "Yeah, let's do it." But yeah, our mission is to shape young lives through the platform of sports, which is kind of, all the things that we've been talking about. And we do that through a two-part objective, and that is to, help kids access sports, as you know, Matt, sports have gotten incredibly expensive, and I don't think that's going to be decreasing anytime soon. And so we want to fill that gap and give as many kids the opportunity to play, best the place best suited for them, and keep them playing. We want to. That's kind of the second piece, is we want to optimize the sports experience so that kids will stay in the game. We provide education training for coaches and parents and high school student athletes to give them tools to create these environments that prioritize the right things.
Yeah.
That we talked about. Again, not against winning. Winning and losing has great value and it's important, but there's this other piece out there that's bigger. And if you're able to weave that other piece in, you'll get your share of wins on the scoreboard. So they kind of go together. So that's what we're doing. I grew up, sports is the last best classroom of the day. You can't duplicate the lessons learned in the sports classroom. And so it's so rich with things, when the leadership's right, when the right things are put into focus. It's truly the best. So that's at the Idaho Sports Commission. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do a little good, and I appreciate your support.
Yeah. And so, if somebody's watching this, we've got a parent watching this, and you mentioned resources that you have available, how can they access those resources? How do they get signed up? Is that to a website or how do they get in contact?
They can contact us through the website. You can reach out to me at tim@idahoyouthsports.com. That's another way. Our education and training is largely provided through sports organizations and schools. But we've also just recently launched a Coach Connect program for coaches to sit down. We've got 6 outstanding coach mentors who have been in the coaching game for 30 to 40 years. And not just because they have the years of experience, but it's the quality of their coaching and the culture that they build and the number of lives that they've impacted along the way and the relationships that they've built. And consequently, it's funny, these 6 people have plenty of their share of wins on the scoreboard. And so we actually fund that. We'll fund one-on-one sit-downs for any coach if they want to hook up with this mentor and spend an hour, 3 different sessions for an hour with these coaches. Dan Hawkins, Tim Brennan, Paul Peterson, Kim Bridges, Paul Rush, and Todd Simas, names that people recognize from this area that, we're just kicking that off now. And so that's one of our resources besides the parent workshops, the coaches workshops through the Positive Coaching Alliance. Any organization, school can reach out to us, if they want that for their culture. And so far we're in 57 schools in Idaho and about 27 youth sports organizations. So, I think we're making a little noise in a positive way. So
keeping the right things to close it and theme there. That's so great. I mean, the resources and pouring in, and as a coach in my early years, I did a lot of bad coaching and a lot of yelling and a lot of the what fors and the what ifs, and so the message here is, if you're a coach and you want a resource, Idaho Youth Commission has resources for you. And so, Tim, I'd like to thank you for today. Thanks for jumping on the call. And, I look forward to seeing you this weekend. We're in another tournament. And so we'll cross paths, my friend.
Well, hey, keep up the good work, man. I like what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. See you later.
Okay. Take care, Bye. Matt.